Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's IUG webcast, Apple Push Notifications on Aura Session Manager, presented by Dennis Sanger, Consulting Engineer from Avaya. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in this IUG program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for on-demand viewing. Second, a Q&A session will take place at the end of the presentation. Please enter your questions into the question window at the bottom of your GoToWebinar toolbar. Third, there will be a short evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please make sure to take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you may like to see going forward. Let's get started. I would now like to turn things over to you, Dennis.
Hi, this is Dennis Sanger, Consulting Engineer with Avaya. I've been working in the telecom industry for 36 years now with AT&T Bell Labs, Lucent, Avaya. I've been working on Avaya Aura Session Manager for about 13 years now, since day one in various capacities, architecture, design, coding, requirements. And today I'd like to talk to you about a new feature on Session Manager in release 8.1.3, Apple push notifications. So the first question is, what is a push notification? Well, first let me go over the agenda. I'll start with a definition of push notifications. What and why is an Apple push notification? What's the call flow that you're going to see with push notifications? How do you set up push notifications? What do you have to do on System Manager? And that's not the only place you have to do admin. You also have to go to avayacloud.com. Once you've got the whole thing set up, how are you going to do testing, status, troubleshooting? There are a few communication manager settings that can help the feature work a little better. What about push notifications in OneCloud Private? Also, there are privacy concerns around this. What about HIPAA, CCPA, and GDPR? And finally, you are almost certainly going to ask, well, if you're doing Apple push notifications, what about Android push notifications? So let's dive in. First, what is an Apple push notification? You may or may not be familiar with the Avaya Workplace app. This is a voice over IP soft phone that can register and subscribe with Session Manager. Then you can place and receive calls like any SIP hard phone. We've also got the Workplace app for Windows and for Android. Push notifications don't apply to those yet. So maintaining the permanent connection from your mobile device to Session Manager is a significant drain on the battery on your device. And because of that, as of iOS 10, Apple is not allowing applications to stay permanently connected to a server. So the Workplace app running on your Apple device has to be prompted to wake up and reconnect with Session Manager before it can receive calls. And the mechanism for waking up the application is a push notification. Now, push notification is really nothing different than any other pop-up you see on your iPhone or iPad. For example, if you're getting breaking news from CNN, you see a little pop-up, that's a push notification. So this is the same kind of thing. It's just a notification sent to your Apple device by an Avaya server via the Apple Cloud. A diagram of how push notifications work. So we've had Apple push notifications working with the Workplace app for a couple of years now. The difference is, in the past, you've needed an AAWG, an Avaya Aura Web Gateway, to make push notifications work. The big change here is that you're going to be able to make push notifications work directly from your Session Manager. So this is what it used to look like before. You've got your caller sending a SIP invite to the Session Manager, and the Session Manager is going to proxy that invite to all of the user's devices. So a desk phone, for example, an iOS device. But as I mentioned, the iOS device is going to go to sleep fairly quickly. I believe it's within 3 minutes because of this restriction that you can't have a permanent connection up to preserve battery life. So the iOS device is not going to receive the invite. Instead, if you've enabled push notifications on AAWG, the AAWG is going to register with SM as a fake endpoint, basically, for that user. It's going to receive the invite, and then it's going to use an outgoing HTTP connection to send that push notification. So the push notification goes from AAWG to the Avaya APN provider. That's a cloud application. It's just one application in the cloud maintained by Avaya, not something that individual customers need to purchase or maintain or even worry about. And then that Avaya APN provider has a connection to Apple's push notification service. The reason we have this Avaya APN provider in the middle is so that there's only one server that needs to authenticate and register with Apple. AAWG authenticates with the Avaya APN provider. That's easy for Avaya to control and authenticate. And then there's just the one connection from the APN provider into the Apple push notification service. And Apple knows where your device is, so it knows where it can send a push notification to wake up your application. The application wakes up, registers and subscribes with Session Manager, and then it's ready to receive the call. So the big change here is, as of Session Manager 8.1.3, we no longer need the AAWG in the middle. The reason for the change is twofold. First, if you didn't already have an AAWG, maybe you weren't really excited about buying one just for push notifications. Well, now you don't need to. And second, there were some fairly subtle feature interactions. So for example, AAWG would count as one of your user's devices. So if you're doing multiple device access, you specify how many devices that particular user is allowed to have. AAWG counted as one, even though it's not really a device. So this is a cleaner implementation of push notifications. Now you get those natively from Session Manager. So let's go through a call flow. First, a word about startup. So in order for push notifications to happen, the iOS device needs to activate push notifications. Previously, it would connect with AAWG over HTTP. It would send a message to AAWG saying, hey, I'm an iOS device. Here's my device token. We'll talk a little more about device tokens later. I want to receive push notifications. So the iOS device needs to do something similar now with Session Manager, except instead of using HTTP, it's going to use a SIP notify, same basic content. What do you do to configure the iOS device to choose Session Manager rather than AAWG? There is a setting sent by ADS, or you can put it in your 46xx settings file, telephony push notification enabled. If that's 0, then push notifications don't happen. If it's set to 1, you're going to use AAWG, and now there's a new setting, 2, which points you at the Session Manager. Previously, you also had to specify the address of the AAWG. You no longer have to specify an address. The iOS device knows that it's going to send this SIP notify to its primary Session Manager. It already knows the address of its primary Session Manager. Now on to sending a push notification to the endpoint. How does that work? So the Workplace app registers with Session Manager, and like I said, within a few minutes, the app is going to go to sleep and drop its connection to Session Manager. So it's no longer able to receive SIP messages from Session Manager. So in addition to sending that SIP invite, SM is now going to send a push notification to that iOS device. And there are 5 scenarios that require push notifications. The obvious one is the incoming call. So the user is getting an incoming call and wants not only the desk phone to alert, but also the application on the iOS device. A second pretty straightforward scenario is you're getting an incoming call to a bridged appearance. So you have a bridged appearance of a different user on your endpoint. That user gets a call, your endpoint also alerts. There's a push notification for that. 2 other cases, you're a member of a call pickup group, or you've got a team button. You'll see push notifications for those to wake up your application so you can receive those calls. And finally, a slightly different application, and that is message waiting status updates. So if somebody leaves you a voicemail, If you have your application open, there's a voicemail icon on the application. If your application's asleep, you'll get a pop-up saying, hey, you now have a message waiting for you. There are two kinds of push notifications. Apple distinguishes between VoIP and non-VoIP. And the difference really has to do with priority. So VoIP notifications relate to actual incoming calls. These are time sensitive. You don't want to delay these notifications. If you've got an incoming call and this notification gets delayed by, say, 30 seconds, well, you've missed your incoming call. So the VoIP notifications are time sensitive. They're sent immediately at high priority. The other notifications, non-VoIP notifications, relate to everything else. So for example, like breaking news from CNN or something, it's not like you have to have that within 2 seconds of the news breaking. That can be delayed a little bit. Same with some of these workplace push notifications, a message waiting lamp update, for example. You don't want to delay it too long, but it doesn't have to show up within 1 or 2 seconds. It can be delayed 5 seconds, 10 seconds. So incoming calls and incoming calls to bridged appearances are going to result in VoIP push notifications with one exception, and that is in the Chinese market. Regulations prohibit VoIP notifications, so those are also going to be non-VoIP notifications. And then all the other push notifications for call pickup or team button or message waiting lamps, those are going to be non-VoIP push notifications. Those will look like just regular pop-ups on your application. A quick look at a call flow. We'll just talk about an incoming call here. The other call flows are fairly similar. So the SIP invite arrives at Session Manager. Session Manager proxies the invite to all of the user's registered devices, including iOS devices. And yes, you can have more than one iOS device for a user. I don't think that's going to be a very common use case, but if you wanted, you could have multiple iPhones, or you can have an iPhone and an iPad. The only limit that applies here is the usual MDA limit for the number of devices that that particular user is administered to be able to have. SM will send a push notification simultaneous with the invite to each of the user's iOS devices. The invites will likely fail because the workplace app is asleep, and that's normal. Instead, the push notification is going to arrive. It wakes up the workplace app. The app registers and subscribes with Session Manager. And when Session Manager sees that register, it's going to reproxy the invite, and now the workplace app alerts. So that is how push notifications work. This is a good place to take a quick look at the questions. What about IM from another workplace app? IMs are not handled by Session Manager. I believe those are handled by the presence server, but I'm not quite certain. So that happens outside of this Session Manager push notification framework. I'm sorry, I'm not real knowledgeable about the IM functionality on Workplace. I should note at this point that any questions that I can't answer during this session, I will research the answers for you, and those answers will be distributed in writing within about a week of this session. They'll be sent out to all the attendees. Okay, continuing. What sort of administration is required to make push notifications work on Session Manager? There's not that terribly much you have to do. You'll have to enable the feature on the global settings. You'll have to, well, you actually won't have to configure notification application settings with very minor exceptions. Provider settings, you'll have to do a little bit of work there. You'll have to log into your Avaya cloud account and copy a key to there so that the Avaya push notification provider knows who you are. You'll have to add a certificate so that the Session Manager can set up a TLS connection to the APN provider. And then finally, you're going to want to test your configuration. Let's walk through those individual forms. First, global settings, nothing too complicated here. There are two relevant fields, well, actually a little more than two, I'll mention that. First, enable mobile push notification. There's a checkbox. You check that box, now the feature is active. Related to that is notification EC500 delay. So let's review what EC500 is. This is a CM feature from many, many years ago that allowed you to alert both your desk phone and to launch a call into the public network to alert your cell phone. This predates smartphones. There were no applications at that point. It was just a standard voice call to your cell phone, which would launch simultaneously. So now that we have these push notifications, you don't want to send a push notification to your iPhone and simultaneously launch a voice call to it. You don't want two calls arriving at the same time, especially given that they're the same call. So you specify here how many seconds you want to delay before you launch the EC500 call. Give the push notification a chance to get to the iPhone rather than launching a plain old cell call. The other thing on the global settings that's relevant is this HTTP proxy host and port. I'll talk more about the interaction of HTTP forward proxies with push notifications in a little bit. This administration, these two fields aren't going to show up until 8.1.12. Push notifications in general are available on 8.1.3. I'll say more about that later. Let's take a second to look at some more questions. Is there anything else I should really answer right this minute? We'll hold on to those questions for a few minutes till we hit a breaking point. We'll continue with the notification application settings. So this would be where you map the application to the push notification provider. And 99.99% of customers are not going to have to do anything on this form. What's already pre-populated is the mapping of the workplace application to the standard Avaya push notification provider, and that's what virtually everyone is going to use. So what you see here is the application ID, Avaya Communicator. That's the workplace application. And then the provider you're going to use for that is the Avaya provider. That's just the standard one. There's one instance of that in the cloud. It is, of course, redundant, and there are different instances, around the world in different regions, all the standard cloud stuff. But to the session manager, it looks like there's just one. There's really nothing you should need to do here, with one exception, and that is we have one customer. It's a non-US government agency that wants to build their own application, and they want to build their own push notification provider. So we've provided this form basically for that one customer. When they've got their application built, they put in their own application ID, and they'll map it to their own push notification provider. But really, it's only that one customer who needs to worry about this, although this functionality is available to anyone else who wants to build their own application and their own push notification provider. The next form you're interested in is the notification provider settings. This is also pre-populated with the address and port of the standard Avaya notification provider. You won't need to change this unless you want to build your own notification provider. What you will need to do on this form is enter your company domain. And once you've done that, you click the Generate Keys button. That will populate the system ID and the public key. It'll also populate the key to export, which combines the system ID, your domain, the public key. You're going to want to copy what's in the key to export, and then you're going to paste it into your Avaya Cloud account. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So you log into your Avaya Cloud account. You go to Manage Companies. Under Manage Companies, you've got a company profile, and there's an Apps tab. Under Apps, you'll find the mobile push notification service. And there you will see the text box where you need to copy your key to export from System Manager. And this is going to identify your company to the push notification provider. I'm not going to go through how you set up your cloud account. It's not that terribly involved, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. So you paste your key here, and then you move on. Actually, one more thing to note. Some customers, not many, but some, have multiple session session manager clusters. What I'm talking about there is multiple groups of session managers managed by separate system managers or system manager geo-redundant pairs. So if for some reason you wanted to segregate your enterprise by continent, say, you've got North America, you've got a system manager pair there with all the session managers, and then maybe you've got Asia Pacific and you've got a system manager pair there with a bunch of session managers, and you don't want your two IT groups stepping on each other, so you want to keep them separated. They've got their separate system managers. If you have a configuration like that, then you'll need to export multiple keys onto your Avaya Cloud account. There's only one text box here. When you display it, you'll see the latest key that you've entered, but the older keys are still there. They're still active. They don't disappear. They don't time out. But I think that's going to be a fairly unusual situation. Okay, you've copied the key. Now you need to add the push notification provider certificate so that you can set up a TLS connection to it. You go to Manage Elements under Inventory. You select one or more session managers. If you're going to try and do more than one session manager at a time, they have to be on the same release. And you do need to export the certificate to all of your session managers, because any one of your session managers is able to send a push notification. The push notification gets sent by the user's primary session manager. So that could be any of these session managers, depending on how you've administered your users. If the primary is not available, then the secondary will send the push notification. Bottom line, you need to go through all the session managers and add the push notification provider certificate. So select your session managers. Under More Actions, select Manage Trusted Certificates, and then you will find yourself able to add the certificate. The store type that you want to select is WebSphere. WebSphere is the IBM provided JSR 289 SIP container that Session Manager runs on top of. So you're going to want to add the certificate to WebSphere. Paste the certificate into the large text box there. And of course, the obvious question is, well, where do you get this certificate? There are a couple of different ways you can get the certificate, but the most straightforward is to look for this PSN at this particular URL. And in that PSN, you'll be able to copy the certificate in PEM format, then paste it into S Manager. Alternately, if you wanted to, you could screenshot this right now and then type it in manually. I wouldn't recommend that. After you've added the certificate, you can look at the certificates that you've added to a particular session manager. You should see a WebSphere certificate. The subject name will include Entrust. The push notification provider is using an Entrust certificate. So now that you've done all these steps, you're going to want to test that the configuration is correct. You go back to the provider settings. You can also do this from the application settings. For some reason that I can't explain, I prefer the provider settings. You've got the Verify Settings button up top. You've got a pull-down menu to specify which session manager you want to verify the settings on. So what's going to happen here is the session manager that you choose is going to send an actual push notification to the APN provider. It's not going to do an actual push to any iOS device. It's just going to go to the APN provider. It's a test message, and the APN provider is going to respond either success or failure, depending on whether your configuration is correct. So in this particular example, you see the pop-up that you get after you click on Verify Settings has the results of your test. In this case, the result is failure because of SSL handshake failure. Now, the most common reason for that is going to be because that session manager does not have the certificate installed. Again, you need to install this certificate for the APN provider on all of your session managers. So I would recommend you test using all of your session managers to make sure that every one of them can successfully push. Just walk through the list and run this test on all of them. There are other reasons you might have an SSL handshake failure. For example, firewall problems in your your enterprise data network, something like that. I did not mean to move forward. Let me move back. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. Let me move back to the slide I was on. Sorry about this. Okay, we were testing the push notification provider. Back one slide. Okay, here we are. We just added the push notification provider and tested it, got the handshake failure. As I was saying, you can get a handshake failure for reasons other than the certificate is not installed, firewall problems in your data network, for example. But assuming all that's taken care of, you got the certificate installed, you run the test again, and you might see this error. Again, there's a failure, there's an HTTP error response. This time it's a 400 bad request. The system ID is not provisioned. What that means is that your key hasn't been exported to the avayacloud.com account. So the way to fix that, obviously, is to copy the key, paste it into your Avaya Cloud account, and you can run the test again. Now, this particular key applies to all your session managers, or at least all the session managers managed by this particular system manager. So this is not something you should have to do multiple times. You export the key once, and it should apply to all your session managers. So once you've exported the key, you run the test again, and this time you get success. So you have now successfully sent a push notification from this session manager to the APN provider and gotten a success response. Okay, before I continue, let's take a quick look at questions. Are there any that I should answer right this minute? Got some very detailed questions here. 8112, a question about 8112. Quick digression about upcoming releases for Session Manager. So this feature is new on 813. It was generally available last October. Since then, we've had a service pack 8131. We're about to release another service pack 8132. Future releases on Session Manager, the numbering has changed pretty dramatically. The next two releases of Session Manager are 8111 and 8112. 8111 is aimed at cloud customers. 8112 is aimed at enterprise customers. Now, actually, it's the other way around. 8111 is aimed at on-premise customers. 8112 is aimed at cloud customers. Because we have these two tracks, that's why the difference in numbering. And then to add a little more complication, after 8111 and 8112 comes 10.1. So some of what you're going to see here is new in 8112. I'll point out when there's something that's new in 8112. Other questions? Will the session manager need access out of the network to reach pnp.avaya.com? Yes. You will need to have access through your data network somehow. How you get to pnp.avaya.com is up to your own IT organization. You can go through a proxy, you can go through an SBC. That's more or less invisible to the session manager, except for the forward proxy functionality that's coming in 8112, and I'll talk some about that in a little bit. Let's see. If you have multiple session managers, who's responsible for the push? I already mentioned that that's the primary session manager for that user. If that's not available, it's the secondary session manager. Is push notification via proxy supported? Yes, it is. And again, I'll talk about that in a little while. Is AADS still required? I wouldn't say it's required. If you want to configure your endpoints using a settings file, you can certainly do it that way, or you can use AADS. Either way, you're going to have to set that that setting to tell the endpoint that it should do that it should activate push notifications with Session Manager rather than AWG. Let's see a few other things here. You will get a copy of the presentation. The requirement to install the certificate on all session managers. So the question is, do you have to install the certificate on session managers that aren't involved in endpoint registration? Some customers like to segregate their session managers. They have some session managers that do endpoint registrations, others that do only trunk routing. If you do it that way, you do not have to install the certificate on your routing session managers. It doesn't hurt to install it, but you don't have to. You only have to install it on session managers that are going to do pushes, that is, session managers that have endpoint registrations. The proxy field that I was showing you, that's available in 8.1.12, so it's not available yet, but there is a workaround for that if you're really dying to use an HTTP forward proxy on 8.1.3. Again, I'll get to that in a little bit. What do you need to do on AADS in order to accomplish this? I guess there's a patch you apply. I'm not an AADS expert. There's some sort of patch you apply to make that setting available. I know you need to be on release 8.1.3, and then in addition to that, there's some sort of custom setting that you have to import to make that setting available. It's the same thing that you would have had to do if you're using AAWG. Okay, so I'm caught up on the questions that are appropriate to answer at this point. Let's continue with the presentation. Okay, so you've tested your configuration. The tests have passed. So now you want to see some statistics about usage of push notifications. On the Session Manager dashboard, there's a new column for push notifications. It shows you 4 numbers. At first glance, those 4 numbers are pretty cryptic. If you mouse over the numbers, though, you'll get a tooltip that tells you what those numbers are. The 4 numbers are average activations per hour for the last 24 hours. So that's how many users have push notification activated. These are not new activations. These are total cumulative activations. When an endpoint activates push notifications, there's no timeout on the push notification. It stays active basically forever. Until it's somehow deactivated either by the administrator, and I'll show you how that works, or by the endpoint itself, or by a session manager when it discovers that that's no longer a valid activation. But there's no timeout, unlike a registration. Registrations time out, need to be refreshed. Activations do not. The reason for that is that the whole point of the activation is that we can do push notifications to applications that are asleep. And we can't really predict how long your application is going to be asleep. Maybe it's asleep overnight while you're not at work. Maybe it's asleep over the weekend. Or maybe you're on vacation and it's asleep for a few weeks. Regardless, we're going to keep that activation around. So this first number is total activations, not new activations per hour, but total activations. The second number, last hour notifications. So rather than activations, these are actual push notifications for calls or message waiting or whatever. So the second number is how many in the last hour. This is for that particular session manager. The third one is how many in the last day. And the fourth number is how many errors. An error would be, for example, an SSL error, or the token for that particular activation was bad. The way a token can turn bad is if you log out of the Workplace app, reset the application, import new settings or something, or if you upgrade the application, you'll get a new token from Apple. Your application will get a new token from Apple. Well, I really can't explain why my presentation is jumping forward. Sorry about that. Let me once again find the slide I was on. Okay, we're on the statistics here. So I was talking about errors. So yeah, bad token. If you upgrade your application, for example, it'll contact Apple, get a brand new token. You'll still have an application or an activation from the previous release of Workplace you're on, and Session Manager will send a push notification using that old token, but Apple will return an error saying, no, that's a bad token, at which point Session Manager will remove that activation. So that's another example of an error. If you click on those numbers are actually a link. If you click on those numbers, it'll take you to a form where you can create some graphs, if that's the sort of thing you want to do. There's a wide variety of graphs, not just this one I'm showing you here. This example graph I'm showing you is the number of activations that we have on our Alpha Session Manager. So we upgraded to 8.1.3 back in October, turned on the feature, and as you can see over time, it's been a steady increase in the number of iOS devices that have activated push notifications. We've got about 150 users for this. There is a status screen that will show you push notification activations for every user. So you get a list of all the current activations. My example here shows you just one activation because this is from my lab machine. But you would, on a production machine, see a list of all the activations and the status. The sorts of information you'll see here, the address is the user's handle. So that's the handle that the user registered with. First name and last name, that comes out of the System Manager database. That's the first name and last name associated with that handle. Next column is the application. There's really only the workplace application right now, unless you write your own application. Activation time, that's when this particular device activated push notifications. So the activation is not something a user has to explicitly do. When you start up your workplace application, it will register and subscribe with Session Manager. It will also automatically activate push notifications if the setting tells it to. Last notify is the last push notification, the time of the last push notification that was sent to this particular device. There's also a status, was the push successful? A little bit of information about the type of the device. In this particular case, I was using Avaya Communicator for iPhone, so that's the workplace app. The device model is the kind of iOS device I was using. It's a little misleading. As you look at this, it says iPhone 13,3. This is what iOS reports, but it's not an iPhone 13. There is no iPhone 13. If you Google for the internal iPhone versions that iOS reports, you'll find a nice list of the mappings. And an iPhone 12 Pro actually reports itself as an iPhone 13,3. The iOS version is exactly what you would expect. This particular iPhone is running 14.3. And then there's the device version. That's the version of the workplace application. And in order for push notifications to work with Session Manager, you need to be on at least 3.15. That was released back in January. If you regularly update your iPhone applications, then this shouldn't be any kind of problem. I believe the latest is 3.18 now. Finally, there's a checkbox for registrations. So in this case, it tells you that this device is currently registered. It would be perfectly normal for that box to not be checked, because a perfectly normal use case, you register your workplace application with Session Manager, and then within 3 minutes, it drops the connection to Session Manager, and maybe you don't make any calls or receive any calls within the next hour. The registration refresh interval is administrable. It's common for people to administer it for 1 hour so that you have to refresh registrations every hour. So that's not very long. You could imagine you could go for an hour without making or receiving calls. And since your workplace app is asleep, it's not going to refresh the registration. So this registration will expire. That checkbox will show up as empty. It's perfectly normal. And if the registration does expire, what it winds up looking like is this. You'll see the checkbox is now unchecked. System Manager doesn't have any information regarding what kind of device you had registered. Also, the user's handle is not present because the registration has expired. But the other information, activation time, last notify, is all still present, and the activation remains active. Other information on the status screen per user. If you were to click on Show, you would see the SIP instance ID and the 2 push tokens. SIP instance ID is an identifier that the application sends to Session Manager just to identify which instance of the endpoint it is. So every instance of a hard phone or a soft phone is supposed to have a globally unique identifier. That would be the SIP instance ID. These 2 push tokens, those are the VoIP push token and the non-VoIP push token. So Apple distinguishes whether you want a VoIP push or a non-VoIP push based on which token you're using. And every instance of the application has 2 unique tokens. No other application on any other device has this same token. Your device may, over its lifetime, have many different tokens as you restart or upgrade your application. This will be the current token that it's using. So what sort of event logging is there? In the operational event log, you're probably familiar with the operational event log where you see users register, you see registrations expire, you see subscriptions. Push notification activations also show up in this event log. So you'll see when a user activates push notifications. You'll see when the user deactivates push notifications. And again, activating and deactivating is not something an end user will do explicitly. It's something the application does when you log in or when you log out. The third example here is what I was talking about earlier, when Apple reports back to Session Manager that this particular device token is a bad device token because it's expired. You'll see that Session Manager removes that activation. Device tokens have a fairly long lifetime. I believe the lifetime is 30 days. So if Apple hasn't seen any usage for a particular token for 30 days, then it will mark that device token bad. And the next time Session Manager tries to do a push to it, it'll get this error response. That way you get rid of stale activations. One other way to get rid of a stale activation is the administrator can explicitly deactivate it. I should have showed you that on the previous slide. There's a deactivate button up there. If you select an activation, click on deactivate, that'll get rid of that push notification activation. The reason you might want to do that is if the user leaves your company, for example. The activation is not going to time out, at least not explicitly, not until Apple decides that it's a bad device token. So if you want to deactivate push notifications for that user immediately, you can go to this form, click on deactivate, and then that user no longer receives push notifications. And you'll see this fourth example in the log file in the operational event log. Before I talk about trace SM, let's take a look at some more questions. Error reporting in Session Manager compared to AAWG. Is there more in Session Manager? Yeah, that's probably fair. Session Manager probably has a more robust error logging, reporting, alarming sort of framework than AAWG does, sure. Do you need to do this for your branch Session Manager? No, branch Session Managers do not do push notifications. So while you're failed over to your branch, you will not receive push notifications. This is a feature that's available only on core Session Managers. I've used the iOS client for years and never noticed any missed calls. You know, that's surprising. If you are using a newer version of Workplace, then you should be dropping the connection and missing calls unless you're using push notifications. I'm going to have to take a closer, it's a very long question, I'm going to have to take a closer look at that later to make sure I answer it correctly. Okay, continuing on, if you've used Trace SM before, you'll be happy to see that there is now a checkbox for push notifications, so you can trace push notifications just like you can SIP messaging. So what does that look like? Well, this is just SIP messaging here. If we're looking at a push notification activation, it's purely SIP. It's an out-of-dialog notify from the endpoint to the session manager, and this is what you would see in trace SM if you were to trace that. So you'll see it's a notify, and the content of the notify is the 2 tokens, the application type, a push notification surface type, which is Apple. Currently, that's the only type. In the future, there will be Android, as well as the SIP instance ID. So there's not a lot of interesting information here. But if you want to trace it, you can, just to make sure that you know that the token is what you expect it to be. Now, the actual push is going to be an HTTP post. So if you check that push notification checkbox in trace SM, you'll see the post going from the session manager out to the APN provider. In this case, you see the 200 OK coming back. And then once the endpoint has received that push notification, it registers with session manager. You see the register down here. And as soon as session manager receives that register, it reproxies the invite. The invite now goes out to the endpoint, which is awake and registered and subscribed. And at that point, the endpoint is going to alert. What's the content of this push? The interesting piece is you'll see the device token as part of the URL for the push. So this will be either the VoIP or non-VoIP device token, depending on the kind of push it is. You'll also see the actual call information, the payload for this push. So for an incoming call, you've got alert type, you've got calling name and number, the SIP call ID, various other parameters of the call. These are the things the application is going to use in order to present information on the application GUI. This particular information is encrypted by Session Manager before it's sent. So this is above and beyond TLS encryption. The connection from Session Manager to the APN provider and from the APN provider to Apple is encrypted via TLS. But in addition to that, this payload is encrypted so that neither the APN provider nor Apple has access to your call information, calling name, number, all of that. I'll talk a little bit about that a little farther down. So even though this information is encrypted by Session Manager, Trace SM shows it to you before the encryption for troubleshooting purposes. Communication Manager settings. There are a couple of settings that you may want to tweak to make the feature work better, depending on the characteristics of your data network. These are all timers having to do with how quickly you want something to happen to the call if the push doesn't succeed. So the alternate routing timer on the CM signaling group form, you may need to increase the alternate routing timer to account for how long the push takes. And again, this depends on your data network. To some extent, it depends on how quickly Apple processes the pushes. But if you're finding that the push notifications don't arrive in time before CM wants to alternate route, then you need to increase the alternate routing timer. I've found that the default values seem to work pretty well, but your situation may vary. Second is the redirect on Optum failure timer, the roof timer. This is on the trunk group form. Same basic idea. If CM doesn't see a response within that timer, it's going to cancel the call. To avoid that, you may need to expand the timer if your pushes aren't getting out to Apple quickly enough. And finally, again, similar, the number of rings on the coverage path form. If you're finding that calls are going to coverage before the push makes it to the endpoint, then increase the number of rings on the coverage path form. Performance considerations. So obviously, you might be concerned that there's more going on your session manager when you add push notifications. That's a valid concern. There are two things going on that weren't going on before. There's increased message traffic. You're going to see more registers and subscribes for, before every incoming call. That's a typical scenario. If you're making a lot of calls or receiving a lot of calls, then your application is never going to go to sleep. Your application is not going to have to wake up and re-register and subscribe. A more typical scenario is going to be that after 3 minutes of being idle, your application goes to sleep, drops the connection to Session Manager. You get a call a while later, the application receives the push notification, it's going to register and subscribe in order to receive the call. The net of this is that the endpoints are going to be registering and subscribing more often than they would otherwise. So that's increased message traffic on your Session Manager. How much increased message traffic really depends on your traffic characteristics. If a typical iOS user is getting 1 call a day, it's obviously not much impact. If that user is getting a call every, say, 10 minutes, then that's significantly more register and subscribe traffic than that user would have been generating otherwise. There's also outgoing HTTP traffic, so these push notifications need to be sent to the APN provider, so that's a little extra processing that happens. Performance measurements under traffic suggest that the performance impact of these two factors, the increased registers and the outgoing push, is pretty modest. It's hard to put an exact number on it because everybody's environment is different. Everybody's traffic characteristics are different. But you're not going to see a dramatic increase in processor usage here. You're not going to see a dramatic increase in network traffic. The recommendation is that no more than 50% of your registered devices should be iOS devices. And again, any given user can have 1 or more iOS devices. Some users won't have iOS devices at all. The recommendation, no more than half of the devices should be iOS devices receiving push notifications. Let's talk a little bit about the cloud. Avaya's new cloud offer is called OneCloud Private. The basic idea here is that you've got an entire Avaya Aura ecosystem in a cloud container. So you don't have a rack of servers on your premise. Instead, it's all in Avaya's private cloud. One of the features offered by OCP is Apple push notifications. Obviously, there's a bunch of other features, but we've been doing trials with Apple push notifications in the cloud. And the wrinkle we discovered is that OCP requires an HTTP forward proxy for internet access. This is not something that customers using AAWG had ever asked for. So AAWG never implemented it. But right away, the OCP people said, no, we definitely need forward proxy support. So we added that in SM813 via a patch. It's not in the actual release, but there is a patch that provides that functionality. There is not GUI support, however. There is not SManager GUI support for the forward proxy. So it's going to require a little bit of script hacking on your Session Manager. It's not difficult, really. You need to add the address of the forward proxy. There's a PSN that describes how all this works, how to get the patch, and what you need to do after that. As of SM8131, you no longer need the patch, but you still need the script hacking because there's still not a GUI. In SM8112, SManager adds the administration for the forward proxy, and I showed you the address is on the global settings, and on the provider, there's a checkbox, do I need to use this forward proxy? So you've got the option of using the forward proxy or not using the forward proxy. This is really intended for OCP, but you as an on-premise customer can certainly take advantage of the forward proxy functionality as well. It's just not all that convenient on 813 or 8131. As of 8112, it's perfectly smooth administration via SManager. Next, this was prompted by the OCP team. They're very sensitive to data privacy. If you're trying to lure customers like hospitals or government agencies or banks into the cloud, you need to have a very good security and data privacy story. So the OneCloud Private people are very concerned about things like HIPAA, CCPA, and GDPR. And their first question about push notifications is, well, are those compliant with the various data privacy laws? Do I really want personal information flying around the internet to Apple? So first, let's talk about the possible compliance problems. HIPAA protects the privacy of health information. CCPA is a law in California, protects the privacy of California residents. GDPR covers the European Union. They're all more or less the same sorts of concerns about exposing people's private data. This was a big concern for Session Manager in previous releases. We targeted log expiration, for example, so that information about the calls people made would not survive if that's a concern for the particular customer. So along the same lines, do we have concerns with the push notification payload? I showed you calling and called name and number can be in the push notification payloads. As I mentioned, that payload is encrypted by Session Manager. It's decryptable only by the target workplace app, so not by any workplace app, but only by the workplace app that this is going to. There's an encryption key that the endpoint negotiates with the Session Manager. Each endpoint has its own negotiated encryption key. So Session Manager encrypts this payload, sends it in a push notification to the application. Only the target application can decrypt it. So the APN provider has no visibility into your call data. Apple certainly has no visibility into your call data. As I mentioned, the data connections from Session Manager to the APN provider and from the APN provider to Apple, those are all TLS, so those are encrypted. So in discussions with Avaya's data privacy experts, they see no compliance problems here. There are two factors. First of all, the data that's in the push is what they consider publicly available data. Your name and your phone number, those are publicly available data, so there's no concern there. There are no credit card numbers involved here. There's no healthcare information, anything like that. This is what they consider publicly available data. And beyond that, the encryption strategy here, they consider that to be industry best practices for protecting the data that there is. So there should be no HIPAA concerns or CCPA or GDPR concerns around using push notifications. And then the big obvious question, what about Android push notifications? The Android version of the Workplace app has a similar problem. Its connection to Session Manager drops just like the Apple version does for the same reason, to preserve battery. So SM is going to need to send push notifications to Android endpoints as well. That is scheduled for SM 10.1. Like I said, after 8.1.3 comes 8.1, 11, and 12 in parallel. Then 10.1 comes after 8.1, 11, and 12. It's a little bit confusing, the new numbering scheme. 10.1 is scheduled for December of 2021. And in theory, we're still working out the requirements and all that, but in theory, it's going to look very similar to the Apple version. There should not be significant differences in how you set it up. You should not need to set up separately for Apple and Android. Oops, went the wrong direction. Okay, and now let's take a look at some more questions. Let's see, dual registration, will you receive the push notification? Absolutely. So if your endpoint is registered with 2 session managers or more than 2 session managers in a future release, you will receive push notifications, yes, because your application will still go to sleep. It will register with 2 session managers, go to sleep, and both of those registrations will expire. You will still need a push notification. A question about running Workplace 3.14 and not seeing an issue with missing calls. You know, I'm not a Workplace expert as such, so I can't really explain why you wouldn't be seeing missed calls. I got to tell you, when I do my testing, when the application goes to sleep, I definitely don't get incoming calls. So if you're not seeing that, I can't quite explain it. As of iOS 10, that's supposed to be an issue. It's not necessarily a Workplace issue. It's more an Apple policy issue. They've decreed that applications are not allowed to keep connections up permanently. The script documented for the proxy option in 8.1.3.1, there's a PSN. I don't have the PSN number at my fingertips, but I'll see if I can research that for you. A couple questions about copies of the slides. You will definitely have those available to you. is there a mechanism to filter out unwanted types of push notifications? Pickup notifications being annoying, for example. No, there is not currently a mechanism for filtering those out. That's an interesting suggestion, though. And then the comment that you can filter those using AAWG based on adaptations on Session Manager. Yeah, given that we're taking AAWG out of the picture, you're not going to be able to use an adaptation to filter out push notifications. But yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. Oh, dual registration related to H323 and SIP. Okay. That's not necessarily relevant here. If you're dual registering H323 and the Workplace app as your SIP endpoint, you will still get push notifications, yes. Okay, let me review the questions and see if there are any that I've missed that I need to answer. And again, if there's some that I can't answer off the top of my head right now, I will research those for you and provide answers in writing. Okay, so reviewing. Yes, Session Manager does need to have internet access. And yes, you can use a proxy server. If you want to configure a proxy, an HTTP forward proxy, then you will need to configure that either on 8.1.12 using System Manager or before that using a patch and a script hack. If you've already got a web gateway, would it be a problem to set up notifications through Session Manager and then later remove the AAWG? You can do that, but you have to be very careful when you do that because you may find you're getting duplicate pushes. You may find that you're getting pushes from AAWG and from Session Manager. If you go to the effort to make sure that you unconfigure the AAWG pushes for the particular user, then you can make this work, but it's fairly tricky to avoid duplicate pushes if you're trying to do that. Okay, so next, a fairly long question about PAI and contact and from. So if AAWG doesn't see the calling party name, it provides PAI contact and from identity display messages. So you were told this is working as designed. Session Manager will behave pretty much the same way. I mean, without trying it, I can't tell you 100% for sure. I'd have to think a little more deeply about this particular question, but I think you're going to find that the behavior between AAWG and Session Manager is pretty similar here. What is 8.1.12? I already laid out the difference between 8.1.3, 8.1.11, and 12, and 10.1. Another question about needing access. You will need internet access from your Session Manager. That can go through a forward proxy. Multiple Session Managers, it will be the primary Session Manager for that user that does the push. If that's not available, it will be the secondary Session Manager. Is push notification via HTTP as opposed to HTTPS supported? No, we use HTTPS only to get to the push notification provider. We had not heard previously that there was a particular desire to use plain old HTTP. In fact, most people are very much interested in using HTTPS. The question about AEDS I've already answered. Here's a question about Avaya Spaces accounts. That's not something I'm really prepared to talk to off the top of my head. I'll have to research that one. We already talked about the certificate requirements related to routing Session Managers versus endpoint registration Session Managers. You only need the certificate on Session Managers that are going to have endpoint registration. Oh, let's see. Error reporting, we talked about that. Branch Session Managers, this is not supported on a branch Session Manager. A couple of questions about not noticing missed calls on iOS clients. I'm going to have to talk to the AAWG team about that because the whole reason for this push notification feature is that when your app is asleep, you're not going to receive calls. Oh, let's see. I think that gets me to the end of the questions. Let's see. Yeah, that's the end of the questions. All right, well, thank you for your attention. And we can stop the recording now.
Thank you, Dennis.